Good evening. Have you ever wondered what life was really like in the Gilded Age? The decades when America's skyline was rising with steel, when fortunes were made faster than they could be counted, and when poverty spread just as quickly in the shadows below. Tonight we'll talk about how it began and why it mattered, about the so-called robber barons at the top of the men whose names you still know because they had the power to stamp them onto universities, railroads, and libraries, and about the millions of workers who lived below, building it all, with no names recorded except in factory rolls or census sheets. We'll ask how women fit into a world of dazzling mansions and grinding sweatshops, how Black Americans navigated new promises after emancipation, but met the same old walls of racism and exploitation, and how the very shine of the era gave way to corruption, collapse, and reform. And of course, we'll wonder aloud, are we living through another Gilded Age right now, with billionaires in place of barons, tech empires in place of railroads, and wealth pulled sky high while ordinary families still wonder if the ground beneath them is stable? If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place. Let this story carry you. And if you're still awake at the end, I'll be here to say goodnight. That's the story I'm telling tonight. The Gilded Age doesn't really begin with sparkle. It begins with smoke. It's 1865. The Civil War has ended. And America is, well, healed is far too generous a word. Imagine a family dinner after the worst fight of your life. Someone threw plates. Someone else isn't speaking. And no one remembers what started it, only that it ended in a way that left the house broken and the furniture scarred. That was America. 4 years of civil war had killed more than 600,000 people. Whole towns were burned down, railroads twisted like spaghetti, and fields lay empty because the men and boys who should have worked them were in graves instead. But here's the thing about rubble. It's profitable. A burned city needs rebuilding. A torn-up railroad needs contract. A debt-strangled government needs loans. And while families are still sewing mourning clothes, businessmen are already sharpening pencils and signing deals. It turns out there's no faster fertilizer for wealth than disaster. If that sounds familiar, it should. Modern billionaires would never waste a good crisis either. Factories begin to rise from the ashes, spitting smoke into skies that had only ever seen stars. The telegraph wires hum across the countryside, telegrams flying back and forth like the 19th century version of text messages. Except these cost money every time you sent one, and there was no emoji to soften the blow. And railroads, those hungry metal creatures, stretch across the land, eating up forests, prairies, and whatever stood in their way. Meanwhile, ships pour into American ports, filled with immigrants who thought they were signing up for the land of opportunity, but quickly discovered they'd really signed up for 14-hour shifts in airless factories. Italians, Germans, Chinese, Irish, Swedes, Poles, Hungarians, they disembark with dreams in their pockets and find themselves crammed into tenements where the walls are so thin you can hear your neighbor cough, and where you hope you don't, because tuberculosis is basically the roommate nobody wanted, but everyone eventually got. This was opportunity, work that paid pennies, that might cost you a finger or a lung, that kept you standing at a machine until your legs went numb. But compared to the famines, pogroms, and poverty they'd left behind, it was still better, just barely. Yet while the poor sweated and coughed their way through factories, a new class of men was rising. You know their names: Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan. These weren't just businessmen. They were empire builders. They controlled oil, steel, railroads, and banks. The bones, blood, and breath of the new industrial America. They made fortunes so massive that rich no longer seemed adequate as a word. Their money could buy cities, governments, or, if they wanted, the moon, though they usually settled for just buying senators. Their lives glittered with a kind of excess that makes even today's celebrity culture look modest. Imagine mansions with ballrooms larger than hotels, dining tables that could seat 100 guests, chandeliers dripping with so much crystal that they probably weighed more than the horses pulling carriages outside. Guests arrived in gowns that shimmered under gaslight, and dinners stretched for 12 courses. Dinners where servants in starched uniforms hovered silently to replace your fork, your plate, or if you were careless, your entire sense of dignity. It's easy to laugh, but imagine you're a steelworker coughing up black dust at the end of your 14-hour day, and you read in the newspaper that Mrs. Vanderbilt has built a ballroom designed to hold 1,000 dancing guests. 1,000! That was more people than lived in entire neighborhoods of New York tenement. And the chandeliers in that ballroom? They probably cost more than you would earn in a lifetime. So here was the contradiction of the Gilded Age. On one side, tenements stacked with families like crates in a warehouse. No plumbing, no privacy, rats for neighbors, and children who grew up smaller and weaker because malnutrition stunted their bones. On the other, marble staircases wide enough for 3 women in hoop skirts to glide down arm in arm, gilded picture frames the size of doors, and banquets where leftover food was scraped into the trash, food that could have fed an entire block of starving workers. Mark Twain saw this shiny, booming America and didn't call it golden, he called it gilded. Gold on the outside, rot on the inside. Like those trendy influencer products today, advertised as luxury, but delivered in flimsy plastic with the gold spray paint already peeling. And if you think the divide between rich and poor sounds familiar, you're not wrong. The Gilded Age was the original version of the 1%. The richest slice of Americans held an absurd portion of the nation's wealth, while the bottom half scrambled for scraps. Swap the mansions for private jets and the ballrooms for super yachts. And you can see why historians keep asking if we're living through another one right. But back in the 1870s, nobody had TikTok to rage about it. What people had were newspapers, and newspapers were often owned by the very same tycoons who didn't exactly want stories about child labor or workplace deaths splashed across the front page. So what you read depended on who paid the editor. A story about progress and prosperity might really mean a new factory was being built, and by progress, they meant more profits for the owners, and maybe a few more mangled hands for the workers. Still, there was something intoxicating about it. For every story of families starving in tenements, there was another of fortunes being made overnight, of inventions that seemed to leap out of science fiction, telephones, light bulbs, bridges stretching across rivers that once seemed impassable. People believed the future was here, and it was dazzling. And so the Gilded Age begins with this strange duality. Unimaginable wealth glittering above, unimaginable misery grinding below. A thin sheet of gold leaf pressed over wood that was already splintering. The illusion of grandeur, the reality of rot. It was an age that promised the world and delivered it to the very few. If the Gilded Age had a royal family, it wasn't the Astors or even the Goulds. It was a group of men who, without bloodlines or noble titles, somehow managed to rule America with more power than many kings in Europe could ever dream of. They were called many things: industrialists, captains of industry, or, more sarcastically, robber barons. And while the title sounds like something out of a children's fairy tale, there was nothing whimsical about the wealth they hoarded, or the sheer force with which they bent the nation to their will. Let's start with John D. Rockefeller. The man made his fortune in oil. Not the kind you drizzle on a salad, but the sticky black sludge that fueled lamps, factories, and eventually automobiles. Rockefeller's Standard Oil became so powerful that at its peak, it controlled about 90% of all oil refined in the United States. Imagine if one single company owned every gas station, every energy provider, and every light bulb. That was Standard Oil. He was methodical, calculating, and famously thrifty. He clipped coupons well into his billionaire years, which is almost admirable, until you remember he was busy crushing competitors and setting up secret deals with railroads, so his oil always shipped cheaper than anyone else's. It's the Gilded Age equivalent of a billionaire refusing to pay shipping on Amazon Prime. Then there was Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate. Carnegie's story was the one people loved to repeat because it sounded like the American dream in its purest form. He came to the US as a poor Scottish immigrant, worked as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill, and rose all the way to building a steel empire that laid the bones of modern America. Bridges, railroads, skyscrapers. If it was made of steel, Carnegie probably had a hand in it. He was also the great paradox of the age, brutal to his workers, but generous as a philanthropist. His philosophy was simple: make as much money as you can, then give it all away before you die. It sounds noble until you realize he spent his career paying workers starvation wage and breaking strikes with hired guns. It's a little like saying, I'll ruin your life now, but don't worry, I'll build a library your grandchildren can use. And then we have Cornelius Vanderbilt, or the Commodore. He started in shipping, moved into railroad, and ran his businesses with the subtlety of a bulldozer. Vanderbilt once said, "What do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power?" Which is about as on brand for a Gilded Age titan as it gets. He wasn't particularly refined. He wasn't throwing grand balls or trying to impress Parisian aristocrats. He was about brute strength, crushing competitors, and amassing a fortune so large that his descendants would spend generations trying and failing to burn through it. If Rockefeller was the quiet accountant, Vanderbilt was the blunt enforcer. Finally, J.P. Morgan, the banker. Morgan didn't just make money, he controlled money itself. His power came from consolidating industries, rescuing failing companies, and sometimes, quite literally, rescuing the US government. In 1895, when the Treasury's gold reserves ran dangerously low, Morgan personally arranged a bailout, as though the United States were just another one of his clients. Imagine if today, during a debt ceiling crisis, a single banker wired over enough cash to keep the government afloat. Morgan did that, and he charged a fee for his troubles. It's no wonder people described him as looking like a cartoon villain. Massive nose, dark eyes, and a glare that could terrify anyone sitting across the boardroom table. These men weren't kings in name, but they lived like royalty, and often with more authority. They built palaces that dwarfed European estates, filled them with art, marble, and chandeliers that dripped with crystal. The wives and daughters of these men wore gowns ordered directly from Paris, dripping in diamonds, walking into ballrooms like glittering exhibits of power. The Astors might have hosted society's parties, but it was Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, and Morgan who paid for the marble on the floor and the electric lights above. But the glamour came with an ugly underside. For every millionaire sipping champagne under gaslight, there were thousands of workers down in the steel mills, the oil refineries, the railroad yards, inhaling soot, losing fingers, and earning barely enough to afford bread. The Gilded Age was exactly that. Gilded, covered in gold on the outside, but underneath was cheap metal, rusting with poverty and labor exploitation. The wealth of a few depended on the misery of the many. Still, the robber barons captured America's imagination. They were admired and hated in equal measure, seen as visionaries who built the modern world, and as villains who destroyed any competitor who got in their way. They were the tech billionaires of their day, except instead of algorithms, they had steel mills. Instead of social networks, they had railroads. Instead of rockets, they had oil refineries. And just like today, their wealth raised the same uneasy question: was all this progress worth the cost? As we picture them now, in their silk waistcoats and tailored suits, stepping into drawing rooms thick with cigar smoke and self-importance, it's hard not to feel a strange mix of awe and frustration. They built fortunes so massive they seemed untouchable, and yet their names are still with us. Rockefeller's wealth created foundations and universities. Carnegie's libraries still stand in small towns across America. Vanderbilt's descendants still pop up in gossip columns. And J.P. Morgan, his bank is still one of the biggest financial institutions in the world. So yes, these men were kings without crowns, not elected, not anointed, not born into royalty. But kings, all the same. Their kingdoms were oil fields, railroads, and steel plants. Their armies were lawyers, bankers, and hired guards. And their legacies are still shaping the world you and I live in today. If the robber barons were kings without crowns, then their wives and daughters were queens without thrones. And in the Gilded Age, that meant ruling over a court of social ambition, conspicuous consumption, and spectacle so dazzling, it made Europe's monarchies look almost understated. Almost. Let's begin with the homes. Mansion is too small a word for what the likes of the Vanderbilts and Astors were building. Fifth Avenue in New York became a literal runway of palaces. Block after block of French chateaux and Italian Renaissance-inspired facades, dripping with carved stone, wrought iron, and acres of marble that had to be shipped across the Atlantic. These weren't houses. They were architectural press releases, carefully designed to scream, "We have arrived." Take the Vanderbilt Triple Palace at 51st Street, a three-house complex so enormous that even Manhattan, never shy about scale, seemed overwhelmed. Or consider the Newport summer cottages. Calling them cottages is the Gilded Age's favorite joke. The Breakers, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II, had 70 rooms and its own private railway spur for guests. It was where you went to escape the heat of New York, as long as your definition of escape included 30-foot ceilings and dining rooms big enough to host a minor European war. And oh, the parties. If the mansions were the stages, the balls were the productions. Elaborate performances of wealth where the audience and the actors were the same people. The most infamous of these was Alva Vanderbilt's 1883 costume ball, an affair that cost the equivalent of over $7 million today. $7 million. On a party, guests wore costumes inspired by history and mythology. One woman appeared as Electric Light, with a working headpiece powered by a hidden battery pack, a kind of steampunk Lady Gaga, before electricity was even in most people's homes. High society at the time revolved around the 400, supposedly the exact number of people who could fit into Mrs. Astor's ballroom. If you weren't on the list, you weren't anyone. Invitations to these events were currency, and they could make or break a family's social standing. Mothers strategized their daughters' debuts as carefully as generals planned campaigns. Marriage wasn't romance, it was alliance. The merging of fortunes and family names like corporate mergers today. Imagine LinkedIn, but with tiaras. Of course, beneath the chandeliers and orchestras, there was always a hint of desperation. These were families only a generation or two removed from shopkeepers, ferrymen, or traders. The marble and the balls were a way of laundering their reputations. They wanted Europe, and themselves, to forget that only yesterday their fathers had been sweating in warehouses or running ferries up the Hudson River. If money couldn't buy nobility, it could at least rent the aesthetic, and the costumes weren't limited to parties. Fashion itself became a competitive sport. Women wore gowns with trains that dragged across entire ballroom, jewels imported from Parisian ateliers, and tiaras that could blind an orchestra section if the gaslights hit them just right. The closets of Gilded Age socialites held more dresses than most women of the time owned in a lifetime, and each one had to be worn once, maybe twice, before being retired, because heaven forbid someone be seen in the same silk twice. Think of it as Instagram culture without the algorithm, but with just as much anxiety. The sheer excess sometimes tipped into the absurd. At one dinner party, the table centerpiece was a miniature working railroad, complete with tiny trains hauling hors d'oeuvres from guest to guest. Another famously featured a stuffed monkey dressed in full evening attire, placed at the head of the table as if he were a distinguished guest. It was the Gilded Age version of performance art, except it came with champagne fountains. Yet while the elite waltzed and feasted, outside their mansion windows the city was teeming with tenements, sweatshops, and overcrowded immigrant slums. A working-class family might be crammed into 2 rooms with no running water just blocks away from Mrs. Astor's palace. The proximity of opulence and squalor was almost theatrical, as if the city itself had been designed for contrast. The poor provided the labor, the rich provided the spectacle, and the newspapers provided the coverage. To be fair, many of these elites were acutely aware of their role in society's theatre. They weren't just rich, they were performing wealth. In a sense, they were influencers before social media. Their outfits, their homes, their marriages, their guest lists, all carefully curated content, distributed through society columns and gossip sheets that hungry readers devoured. And just like influencers today, they had to keep topping themselves, creating bigger, brighter, more dazzling spectacles to hold attention. If you're picturing a gilded carousel constantly spinning, with each socialite desperate not to fall off while the poor watch from the shadows, you're not far off. That was the high life in the Gilded Age, dazzling, ridiculous, and in many ways exhausting. Because here's the truth, no one at those balls admitted out loud. The glamour was fragile, the gowns wore thin, the jewels were pawned, the marriages cracked, and just beyond the glittering chandeliers, the muckrakers were sharpening their pens, ready to drag the spectacle into the light. But for a moment, a brief, champagne-soaked moment, the Gilded Age elite managed to convince the world, and perhaps themselves, that they were untouchable. For every gilded mansion with a ballroom dripping in crystal, there was a factory floor dripping in sweat, and sometimes blood. This was the other side of the Gilded Age, the side that didn't make it into Edith Wharton novels, except maybe as a passing reference to The Help. Factories swallowed millions of immigrants and rural migrants into their brick bellies, demanding 12, sometimes 14 hours a day of labor for what amounted to pennies. Men bent over whirring machines, women hunched in sweatshops stitching endless seams, and children, yes, children, worked beside them because their tiny fingers could reach where adult hands could not. The average child worker in the 1880s earned maybe $1 a week, if that. Childhood was not a time of play, it was a time of exhaustion. The only swings most children saw were the ones on dangerous textile machines. The term sweatshop wasn't just metaphorical poetry, it was literal. Imagine a windowless room jammed with dozens of workers, the air so thick with dust and steam you could chew it. The heat was unbearable in the summer, the cold bone-cutting in the winter, but the pace never slowed. Breaks? Unheard of. The logic was simple. If a worker fainted, there were 10 more waiting outside, desperate for the job. Housing wasn't much better. The glittering elite built Fifth Avenue palaces with marble staircases wider than some city streets, while their workers crammed into tenements that seemed designed more for rats than for people. Overcrowding was the rule. Entire families packed into 1 or 2 rooms, with boarders crammed in the corners if rent was due. Sanitation was laughable, if not tragic. One outdoor toilet might serve dozens of people. Tuberculosis, cholera, and typhoid didn't just go around, they made themselves at home. And yet, the irony is almost too sharp. While society ladies fussed over table settings with 18 different types of forks, workers often didn't have a plate at all. They ate stale bread and scraps after 12 hours of brutal labor. While the barons flaunted their wealth with costume balls dressed as kings and queens of Europe, their employees literally risked burning alive in factories with locked doors, as they did in tragedies like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, where dozens of women leapt from windows because escape routes had been sealed to prevent theft. It's tempting to imagine this kind of suffering as distant history, but if you've ever bought a $5 t-shirt online and wondered how on earth it could be that cheap, well, the ghost of the Gilded Age factory floor is still alive and stitching. The Gilded Age was essentially a tale of 2 cities, except they occupied the same streets. In the morning, carriages clattered down Broadway carrying ladies in silk gowns, while barefoot children darted between wheels, hawking newspapers or begging for coins. At night, Gaslights illuminated both the chandeliers of the elite and the dingy alleys of the poor, a reminder that glamour and misery coexisted like two sides of the same tarnished coin. And perhaps the cruelest part, the very labor of the poor was what financed the wealth of the rich. Every glittering mansion, every extravagant ball, every gilded fountain was built on the backs of those who never got to step inside. So, while we picture the grand excess of the Gilded Age, it's worth remembering, for every champagne toast in a ballroom, there were coughs echoing in a tenement. For every crystal chandelier, there was a child bent over a machine by candlelight. And that's what made the gilded part of the Gilded Age so chilling. It was never gold all the way through. Perfect. I'll keep the same balanced documentary with bite, tone and flow right into segments 5 and 6. If you've ever scrolled through your social feed and seen people arguing whether billionaires are geniuses who built everything we use, or greedy parasites hoarding wealth while the world burns, congratulations. You've just stumbled into the same debate people had about the Gilded Age's most infamous characters, the so-called robber baron. Names like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt and Morgan weren't just businessmen, they were forces of nature. They controlled oil, steel, railroads and finance with an iron grip. John D. Rockefeller turned Standard Oil into such a monopoly that it made competitors irrelevant. Andrew Carnegie built an empire of steel that literally forged the modern skyline. J.P. Morgan was a banker so powerful that when the US government ran out of gold, he basically bailed out the entire country with his own checkbook. Now, whether you see them as ruthless villains or brilliant visionaries depends on where you were standing. To their admirers, they were captains of industry, self-made men who embodied the American dream, lifting the nation into modernity. To their critics, they were predators who crushed unions, bought politicians, and wrung every drop of profit from their workers' misery. And the truth? Both versions were right. These men did build things that changed the world, but they also built them on the backs of workers making starvation wages, and they rarely lost sleep over it. Their philanthropy, and there was a lot of it, from Carnegie Libraries to Rockefeller Foundations, didn't erase the fact that they treated human labor like coal, cheap, replaceable fuel. The term robber baron captured the public's unease. These men weren't robbing trains with masks and guns. They were robbing entire industries with contracts and consolidation. It was modern plunder, dressed in business suits, and it left behind a question we still wrestle with today. Does the end justify the means? If a man builds universities but also locks his workers out of factories, which part of his legacy counts more? Of course, it wasn't just business running wild. Politics was having its own little masquerade ball of corruption. The Gilded Age is practically synonymous with backroom deals, cigar smoke, and the kind of political arrangements that make today's scandals look almost quaint. Take Tammany Hall in New York, led by boss William Tweed. He and his cronies perfected the art of machine politics, buying votes, handing out jobs as favors, and funneling public money into private pockets. Tweed's ring stole, depending on whose math you believe, somewhere between $40 and $200 million from the city. That's billions in today's terms. And yet, people kept voting for him because he handed out coal in the winter, food baskets at Christmas, and jobs to desperate immigrants. Corruption, yes, but corruption with a friendly handshake. Congress wasn't much better. Lobbyists roamed the Capitol like they owned the place, because in many ways they did. Railroad companies literally handed out free passes to lawmakers. Bribes flowed freely. The Senate earned the nickname the Millionaires Club, and not because of their government salaries. It was politics as spectacle, shiny on the surface, rotten underneath. Elections were rowdy affairs, fueled by alcohol, intimidation, and sometimes outright violence. Voter turnout was astonishingly high, but so was voter manipulation. Ballots were stuffed, results were rigged, and party loyalty mattered more than policy. And yet, like with the robber barons, it's complicated. Out of this swampy mess came reform, slowly, painfully. Civil service exams began to replace the old spoils system, where jobs were handed out like party favors. Journalists, the so-called muckrakers, started pulling back the curtain, exposing scandals in the press. And the very outrage that corruption generated eventually laid the groundwork for the progressive era, when reformers tried to scrape the grime off the gilded surface. So while the Gilded Age gave us glittering wealth and visionary growth, it also gave us a political system where money talked louder than voters, a legacy that, let's be honest, doesn't feel all that unfamiliar. If the Gilded Age was a show, women were expected to play their parts carefully, but the roles couldn't have been more different depending on where you sat in society. At the top were the society ladies, wives and daughters of the elite, who were essentially living mannequins for wealth. Their job was to dress well, host dazzling balls, and marry advantageously. Think corsets so tight you couldn't breathe, gowns with enough fabric to carpet a ballroom, and an endless carousel of calls and teas. It was elegance, but elegance that came with rules so rigid you could barely move without breaking. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the social ladder, women worked hard in factories, laundries, kitchens, and homes not their own. Immigrant women sewed in sweatshops for pennies a day, often in conditions so dangerous that one wrong spark could kill dozens. Domestic servants worked around the clock, invisible and often vulnerable to exploitation. And mothers carried the double burden, caring for children while also earning wages because survival demanded it. But here's the twist. The Gilded Age was also when women began to crack the surface of public life in new ways. The suffrage movement picked up steam, not yet victorious, but louder. Activists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton kept hammering at the idea that women should have the vote, even as politicians rolled their eyes and said, "Not now, maybe later." Women were also central in reform movements. They founded settlement houses, fought child labor, and organized labor strikes. The irony of the Gilded Age was that while high society women were expected to embody delicacy and passivity, working class women were embodying grit and resilience, and in doing so, were slowly changing the country. So, while the men of the Gilded Age made headlines with railroads and fortunes, women were reshaping the fabric of society in ways that weren't as glittering but were just as revolutionary. Now let's talk about the people who built the Gilded Age, but rarely got the credit. Immigrant. Between 1870 and 1900, millions arrived from Europe. Italians, Poles, Hungarians, Jews, and many others. And from Asia, especially China. They poured through Ellis Island or Angel Island, bringing with them languages, traditions, and hopes for a better life. What they found was a double-edged sword. On one side, opportunity. America was booming, and there were jobs in factories, railroads, mines, kitchens. Immigrants took the hardest, dirtiest, lowest paid work and kept the engine of industrial growth running. They built the skyscrapers and laid the steel tracks. They crowded into tenement apartments, sometimes 10 to a room, surviving on little but ambition and endurance. On the other side, hostility. Nativism was alive and well, and many native-born Americans feared immigrants were stealing jobs, corrupting American culture, or, in the case of Chinese workers, simply too foreign to fit in. Laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 openly discriminated, shutting doors while still depending on immigrant labor. Stereotypes and slurs followed newcomers into every workplace and neighborhood. Yet despite the discrimination, immigrant communities thrived. They built churches and synagogues, published newspapers in their native languages, and created networks of mutual aid. They turned neighborhoods into cultural strongholds, Little Italies, Chinatown, and Jewish quarters that remain part of American cities today. The immigrant experience of the Gilded Age was one of contradiction, celebrated for fueling growth, despised for being other. It was survival with dignity, squeezed into the cracks of a booming but unforgiving society. You can only push people so far before they push back. By the 1870s and 1880s, industrial workers had had enough of starvation wages, 14-hour shifts, and bosses who saw them as replaceable cogs. The Gilded Age may have looked golden on the surface, but underneath it was a pressure cooker, and the labor movement was the steam beginning to escape. The Knights of Labor, one of the first big unions, declared that workers deserved more than scraps. They wanted shorter workdays, 8 hours, not 14. They wanted safer conditions, better pay, and, frankly, to be treated like human beings instead of disposable tools. Their slogan was as simple as it was radical: an injury to one is the concern of all. Of course, the wealthy industrialists were horrified. Why pay workers fairly when you could just hire desperate immigrants for less? Why allow an 8-hour day when the machine could run 24? Strikes broke out, sometimes peaceful, often not. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 shut down rail lines across the country, and the response was swift. Militias called in, police batons swinging, shots fired. Dozens of workers were killed. The Haymarket riot in Chicago in 1886 started as a rally for shorter workout and ended with a bomb thrown, chaos, and a violent police crackdown. Business leaders seized the chance to brand unions as dangerous, anarchist, even un-American. Still, workers kept organized. Coal miners, steelworkers, textile laborers. They knew survival depended on solidarity. Out of these struggles came the American Federation of Labor, more focused and pragmatic than the Knights, bargaining not for utopia, but for incremental gains. The irony of the Gilded Age is that while tycoons were celebrated as visionaries, the workers who made their fortunes possible were beaten, arrested, and demonized for daring to ask for bread instead of crumbs. Yet their persistence planted the seeds for the labor rights we take for granted today. Weekend, overtime, safety law. So yes, the Gilded Age glittered, but beneath the shine, you could hear the rumble of working men and women saying, enough. If money built the mansions of the Gilded Age, it also bought the politicians who were supposed to regulate. Politics in the late 19th century wasn't so much a noble calling as it was a side hustle for anyone who could perfect the art of the bribe. And no one embodied this better than the great showman of corruption himself, William Boss Tweed of New York's Tammany Hall. Tweed wasn't just a politician, he was a machine. Imagine your city government today, the mayor, city council, contractors, courts. Now imagine one man pulling the strings of the whole lot, while also taking a cut of every building contract, every road, every courthouse. Tweed and his cronies funneled millions, by some estimates, the modern equivalent of billions, into their pockets. How? Through what they charmingly called honest graft, which is really just like saying, I stole your sandwich, but at least I didn't lie about it. The Tweed Ring became infamous when they built the New York County Courthouse, a project that ballooned from a $250,000 budget to a staggering $13 million. To put that in perspective, that's like ordering a sandwich and getting billed for the entire restaurant. Contractors were charging the city for literally everything. One bill included $41,000 just for chairs. Another billed $179,000 for 3 tables and 40 chairs. Gold-plated seating, perhaps. And yet the public tolerated it for years. Why? Because Tammany Hall, for all its corruption, handed out favors. Need a job? Tammany had you covered. Struggling immigrants? Tammany gave coal in the winter and food in the summer. Provided you voted the right way come election day, it was welfare with strings attached, and it kept the machine running. But Tweed flew too close to the sun. Thomas Nast, a cartoonist with a mean pen, drew Tweed again and again in Harper's Weekly until the public couldn't ignore the spectacle. Nast's cartoons did what statistics couldn't. They made corruption visible, funny, and infuriating all at once. Eventually, Tweed was arrested, escaped to Spain, and was identified by, you guessed it, one of Nast's cartoons. And here's the kicker. Corruption wasn't confined to New York. Political machines ran cities across America. Backroom deals decided everything from railroad land grants to Senate seats. The Gilded Age wasn't just gilded in gold, it was lined with grease. If democracy is supposed to be about the will of the people, this era was more about the will of the highest bidder. And yet, sound familiar? Corporate lobbying, PAC money, campaign donations. Let's just say the 21st century hasn't exactly left the playbook in the past. Boss Tweed might even be impressed by the scale of today's legalized corruption. Every gilded party eventually ends, and the Gilded Age was no exception. The glitter, the gold, the champagne fountain, all of it came crashing down in 1893, when the US economy did what economies sometimes do, tripped over its own shoelaces. It started with shaky railroads. Remember those massive railroad empires that ate up land, money, and politicians by the trainload? Well, it turns out you can only lay so much track before investors start to notice that not every town in America actually needs a luxury station. When several major railroads went bankrupt, the panic spread like wildfire through banks and businesses. Suddenly, the golden age of speculation looked a lot less golden. The Panic of 1893 kicked off one of the worst depressions in US history up to that point. Unemployment soared, breadlines grew, and suddenly, the men who once swaggered down Wall Street in top hats found themselves hiding from angry mobs. Farmers were hit especially hard. Falling crop prices, foreclosures, and drought combined into a misery stew. Meanwhile, urban workers lost jobs en masse as factories shuttered. The tenements, already crowded, swelled with desperation. Ironically, while ordinary people starved, the rich still found ways to gild their boredom. Lavish parties didn't stop entirely. They just became a little more private, tucked behind iron gates and velvet curtains, as if pretending the depression wasn't happening could make it go away. It's a bit like someone today insisting on posting Instagram photos of their Maldives vacation, while the rest of us are comparing grocery price at 3 different stores. The cracks were too deep to... Labor strikes erupted across the country. The Pullman strike in Chicago turned violent, with federal troops called in. Workers, long ground down by 12-hour days and starvation wages, finally demanded more. Farmers, too, organized into the populist movement, railing against railroad monopolies and demanding reforms. For the first time, the fury of the bottom 90% threatened to topple the carefully balanced pyramid of wealth. And here's where the curtain really begins to close on the Gilded Age. Out of the chaos came the stirrings of the progressive era, muckraking journalists, reformers, and politicians who argued that maybe, just maybe, letting children work in coal mines for pennies, while industrial barons built marble ballrooms, wasn't the best way forward. The era that followed would bring trust-busting, regulation, and new social reforms, though let's not pretend it all got solved overnight. Still, by the turn of the century, the gilding had worn thin. America had seen behind the curtain, and what it found wasn't just gold and glitter. It was corruption, inequality, and suffering papered over with wealth. The Gilded Age was dazzling, yes, but it was also dangerous, fragile, and unsustainable. And maybe that's why it fascinates us today, because it feels eerily familiar. The skyscrapers, the billionaires, the political machines. You can almost squint and see it happening all over again. So the music stopped, the lights dimmed, and the Gilded Age ended, not with a triumphant crescendo, but with the hangover of a nation that had danced too long at a party it couldn't afford. Got it? Here's a soothing, reflective outro that matches the slow storytelling pace and ties the series together. And so, that was the Gilded Age, a time when fortunes were made overnight, when railroads cut through mountains, when steel rose into the sky, and when the gap between the mansion on the hill and the tenement in its shadow grew wider than ever. It was an age of dazzling light and deep shadows, of parties that sparkled like gold and factories that burned like hell. It left us with skyscrapers, museums, universities, and railways, but also with strikes, poverty, and the reminder that every glittering surface has cracks beneath it. Looking back, it feels almost like a dream, part fairy tale, part nightmare. And in many ways, it still whispers to us. When we hear about billionaires today, about private islands and super yachts, about workers struggling while markets soar, we hear echoes of the Gilded Age. The names and fashions have changed, but the story still feels familiar. So tonight, as you let this story drift away, remember that history is never really gone. It lingers, it repeats, it waits. The Gilded Age may have ended more than a century ago, but its glitter and its ghosts still shine faintly around us. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you made it to the end. Let the weight of the day go. And let sleep carry you, gently, away from the noise and into the quiet. Good night, written by Clara Finch, because some stories deserve a soul.